Well, whenever you write a book, quite a lot of it has to seem as if it's come out of a real experience. And yet, if you're writing about a period, as I was, which was 40 years before the time that I was writing, around the time, a few years after independence and partition, the first general elections, land reforms, all sorts of stuff, women's power, opposition, I had to talk to people. After all, I couldn't imagine what it's like to enter the room of a courtesan, because in India there are no courtesans left. I mean, it had all become different, much more crude, and I couldn't find out what it was like to fight the British, what it meant for the families of the people, until I talked to some people who had actually been in that situation. So I don't think one should give the impression that a lot of it has come from research, but the fact of the matter is that some of it has, if you can consider conversations to be research. Well, their behavior obviously was partly real and partly imaginary, but the world itself that I was describing, I tried to make it as realistic as possible so that people would forget about the writer and concentrate on the story, especially people who lived in those times. If suddenly they find a fact that's completely wrong or a situation which doesn't ring at all true, they'll just think, ye to sirf kitab hi hai. They don't feel as if they're actually entering the lives of other people. So to that extent, I felt it was important to be realistic. I love music. And quite often an author's enthusiasms enter the books that he or she writes. And but even in A Suitable Boy, there's quite a lot of music. After all, Sayeeda Bai Firozabadi, the courtesan, sings not only ghazals, but say on Holi or something, she'd sing Holis and Kajris and so on. Then there's Ustad Majid Khan Sahib, the great exponent of Khayal. And my own training, such as it was, I was a shishya of Pandit Amarnath. I'd studied for a little while, and he was a shagird of Ustad Amir Khan Sahib. So I've always loved music. Western music came later to me, but I like that also very much. And so an equal music is based, of course, upon the story of this violinist and this pianist. Well, The Golden Gate was my first novel. At that time, I had no idea that I'd be interested in writing novels. I found the novel an enjoyable form to read, but I much preferred to write poetry. So in a funny way, The Golden Gate, by both being a long poem in stanzas with rhyme and meter and so on, and also being a novel, acted as a sort of bridge which allowed me to cross the river between poetry and fiction. Well, I'm still thinking about it, so I really don't know much about it. It's not as if I'm trying to keep anything from anyone else. It's that in my own mind there's so much uncertainty about what will happen. Lata now, whom I left when she was 20 years old, is now 80. So her whole life, or much of it, has passed. Maybe there's a decade or two ahead of it, but many of her thoughts are looking backwards. Meanwhile, there's a younger generation and a younger than younger generation. India at that time was having its first general election. It's just had its 15th by the time I write the book. So a lot has changed, both in her private and personal life and in the life of the country. So to that extent, I can tell you that that'll be in it. But as to what the story is, what's going to happen, is going to surprise me as well. Yes, I would have to say yes. I mean, the reason for studying a language, for me at least, is not only to be able to talk to people who are living, but also to talk to the dead, or to be talked to by the dead, and by living writers as well in those languages. So, with Chinese, for example, my first interest in Chinese came through reading translations of some 8th century Chinese poets whom I really loved. And as a result, I learned the language because I thought, if I'm getting so much pleasure from the translation, what must the actual language have? Then later I translated some of those poets myself. I went to China, I lived there for 2 years. I'll repeat that sentence, huh? You want me to repeat that? Okay. I went to China, I lived there for 2 years, and my economics dissertation, which originally had nothing to do with China, I kind of massaged it so that it would give me the opportunity to visit. And that's what I did. I lived there. In fact, my first book was about hitchhiking home to Delhi, across the Himalayas, across Tibet. And I suppose that was the first time I got published. So it was also the making of me as a writer. I think it's very lively. But at the moment, I mean, this festival, I'm very glad to see, concentrates not only on English but also on Urdu. Obviously not so much on other languages, but because they are not, Sindhi, Balochi, etc., Pashto, Punjabi. But I think it's a lively scene. The problem is that given the levels of literacy in both our countries, the extent to which literature can go is somewhat limited. And even among those people who read, for the most part they read newspapers. Now if you close down the door on offices or published a book on one day and a newspaper on the other, then maybe that would improve the literacy. I don't want to talk about particular writers because then I'll leave out others and so on, but I've read with great pleasure some Pakistani writers, and I think the form of the short story seems to be flourishing here in Urdu and in English very well, which is a difficult form. I've never succeeded in writing, well, a good short story. I've written some bad short stories, luckily not published, but it's a form I greatly admire. As far as what impact it made in the rest of the world, I really don't keep up with trends so much, but I know that at least English writing in Pakistan has had quite a reasonable amount of recognition elsewhere. Or by improved you mean increased? Yeah, because I said that advisedly because sometimes too much publicity is not a good thing for a writer.
Why do you say that?
Because we're private people. Most of our work is done, we're sort of kitabi kiras, we sit and write in our...
Once you've written your book, you do want that publicity.
But you certainly want the books to sell. But if you're a shy person, you're not very good at interviews. I was surprised that A Suitable Boy turned out to be a bestseller because, as you said, it's a long book. Who has the patience to read such a long book, and especially abroad? It's set in an obscure period of Indian history. There isn't even a glossary to explain the words. There's a lot of politics. God knows. There's not very much sex. So why the heck did people buy the book? I don't know. It's still a bit of a mystery. I hope not, because that other book took such a lot of my life up. So I hope it'll be shorter, but these books have a way of running away with you. You become a kind of अपने किरदारों के कैदी बन जाते हैं ना, तो so then you have to follow their lives.